Okay, morning everyone. Hi there. I hope you enjoyed the first session of the day. We're just waiting for one of our speakers to join us, but I think we'll start because we're short of time. So my name's Moira Sinclair. I work at Paul Hamlyn Foundation. My pronouns are she, her. For people who are dialing in online, I'm a white woman in my 60s now with grey hair, and I'm wearing a green dress. So for all of you here today, I'm just going to outline the session so you know you're in the right place. If you all stand up and walk out, I'll be worried about the arrangements, but let's see how we go. So this panel is about the choices we make today and how they're having a material impact on the quality of life for future generations, as well as on the viability of the planet. And we've heard a lot of conversation about that first thing this morning, and those who inhabit the planet alongside us. And I think the big question for us, for the guests we have in person and online, is about how do we bring awareness of the future into the present so that we steward all kinds of wealth in a way that is accountable to future generations. And that's quite a tricky question, I think, particularly for those of us who are responsible for money and for the distribution of money. How do you get into that future space rather than just focusing on the here and now and the real challenges of the here and now? So I think there are many charities focused on current challenges, and that's where a large proportion of philanthropic money goes. But are there ways that those that hold wealth might take a longer term and more systemic view? It's certainly something we've been talking about at Paul Hamlyn Foundation. And if we get this conversation flowing here, what I'm hoping is that we'll have a sense of what it means to consider future generations in any choices we make today. And that includes young people today who are going to take over the baton of stewardship in the next 2 decades. And I think Amira and Euella are definitely two of those young people who are leading the way in some of these conversations. We might understand some of Sophie's work, and I can see she's just joined us. Hi, Sophie, good morning. And I'm going to introduce her in a second. We might think about terms like intergenerational equity and what that actually means. And I think perhaps if we're talking about hearts as well as heads, the sort of sense of being able to hold in our hearts the tension and reality, the balance that we need between accountability to those who are alive now and for those who are coming in the future. And maybe at the end, we'll begin to think about what it means for all of us to be good ancestors in this space. There's a lot to cover, but I've got this brilliant panel of people with experience and thinking and opinions to help support us in getting to some of those points. So, Sophie, I hope that you're going to be able to hear us and we can hear you, and I think we'll come to you first. So you were the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. Can you tell us a little bit about your work in Wales and now globally? Why is a commitment to future generations important?
Absolutely, and it's lovely to be with you. So Wales was the first country in the world to pass legislation to protect the interests of future generations. So the Senedd, our national parliament, passed a law in 2015 called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and it does a number of things. So it sets out this overarching principle that requires all of our public institutions, so from our local authorities right up to government, and names Welsh ministers specifically, and all of our institutions in between, that they must demonstrate how when they're taking decisions, they're seeking to meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It then sets out 7 long-term wellbeing goals, and the beauty of these goals is that they were actually co-created with the citizens of Wales. So we held a national conversation called The Wales We Want, where we posed the question, what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, grandchildren and future generations to come? And there's a few kind of game changers, if you like, in terms of those long-term wellbeing goals. So they span political cycles, and there's the big kind of elephant in the room, isn't it? That, why do we take short-term decisions? Why are we so bad at, acting for the long term? Because politicians want, everything to happen within the next 5 years or what have you, so that they can get re-elected. So having those long-term goals co-created by citizens, spanning electoral cycles, really important. And it does a number of other things, but it also then puts this accountability mechanism in the system. So I was an independent commissioner, I suppose similar to the Children's Commissioner, but my role was to be the guardian of the interests of the future generations of Wales. So to be the conscience, if you like, of the unborn, which sounds like a bit of a crazy concept. But if you know, and of course, I can't predict exactly what the unborn want, but I do know that they'll want, a healthy planet to live on, that intergenerational inequity, wealth inequity, and so on is not good for current or future generations, that there's a range of things that they will need. So my job was basically to hold the government and others to account on how they, when they were taking decisions, they were applying the Future Generations Act and how they were considering those yet to be born. And when I talk about it, I'm in Berlin at the moment talking to the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. Who knew there was such a thing as creative bureaucracy? But when I talk about it in other countries, the usual response is, hang on a minute, why doesn't every country have that? Why doesn't every country have this legal requirement and accountability mechanisms to force their politicians to think and act for the long term?
And Sophie, we know what politicians can be like, not all politicians, but some. How much do you think you were actually listened to in that space, and you were able to hold people to account? When I know the post is there, but what did that actually translate to in reality?
Well, I mean, the basics of the post was that I couldn't force anyone to do anything or stop anyone doing anything. But I did have powers of intervention in decision making and basically powers to force institutions, politicians and others to account, I suppose, to me and to future generations. The first big test of the legislation was that government had plans to spend the entire of their borrowing capacity building a 13-mile stretch of motorway to deal with the problem of congestion. So, if we think about this is what we always do. We never really invest properly in public transport. We've got a problem with congestion, we just build more roads. And that, I intervened in that and asked the government to show me how that stacked up with long-term thinking, how it was in the interests of future generations and how it applied our 7 long-term wellbeing goals. To cut a long story short, it was regarded as a done deal, and following that intervention and holding a mirror, if you like, up to government to say, show me your workings on this, they changed their mind. They cancelled the road. And we went further then to look at all of the infrastructure investment in Wales to say, show me how you've applied the Future Generations Act to all of your infrastructure investment. As a result of that, on transport particularly, because it doesn't stack up. Building roads does not stack up with the climate emergency. It doesn't stack up with increasing rates of obesity and high levels of air pollution. It doesn't stack up in terms of equity because the poorest people in our community often don't own cars and so on. So we actually, from that, reviewed all of our infrastructure investment, a new transport plan, and 51 of 55 pre-approved road building schemes in Wales cancelled. Instead, that money is invested in public transport and active travel, with the first trains from the South Wales Metro being rolled out just last month. So that's just one example. We've reformed curriculums. We've had pilots of a universal basic income. We've got a new economic model in Wales, and that's all framed around the Future Generations Act. But we still have a way to go, because this is a generational mission to change the cultures, the way in which we take decisions, and how we do that for the long term.
I mean, it's an astonishing achievement just to hear that one example, let alone to think about some of the other things you've been doing. I'm going to come to the other two panellists in just a second to open up this conversation. But in terms of the visibility of the role, you said the original wellbeing goals were co-created with the public. How visible do you think the work you were doing was for young people in Wales? Do you feel as though they continue to be engaged in that process?
Yeah, I mean, we can always do more. And I work very closely with the Children's Commissioner in terms of her particular role engaging with children and young people, but also set up things like a Future Leaders Academy, where we had future leaders from across a range of different sectors, so community leaders, people who were young care leavers and activists in that space, people who were early career engineers and so on. And one of the really interesting things that we did there was set up a reverse mentoring scheme. So we paired those young leaders with the 30, each year with the 30 most senior leaders in Wales. So the Permanent Secretary of the Welsh Civil Service, the Chief Executive of Cardiff Council, so on and so on. And there's been some really significant impact there with those young leaders actually mentoring those existing leaders, eyeballing them, if you like, and saying, why are you taking decisions in that way? Bringing perspectives like, we are digital natives, you who are taking decisions at the moment are not. You don't experience climate anxiety in the same way that we do, and so on. And so some of the things that have changed as a result of that, we now have some of those young leaders on the Welsh Government shadow board overseeing all of the policy delivery of the Welsh Government. One of our young leaders mentored the Chief Executive of the Football Association of Wales, who now have their first sustainability and wellbeing strategy with the ambition to be the most sustainable football association in the world through the lens of delivering those 7 wellbeing goals. And that's because Sam, the reverse mentor of Noel Mooney, the chief executive, was challenging him to do that. So lots of other great examples. Can young people be more engaged? Absolutely. And I think there are some, quite worrying trends that we're seeing at the moment around distrust in institutions and democracy and so on. But I think that this is something where we're saying specifically, we in Wales are, not just talking about acting in your interest, but we actually have a law that requires us to do that.
Amazing. I might come back to you in a bit on how you measure that impact, because it's something I talk about with my trustees a lot. If you're thinking into the future, I can't tell them exactly what's going to happen today. But before we get on to maybe those rather techie points, Euella, Rising Arts Agency is a creative agency mobilising for radical change. And your strapline is that you're about building a movement and fighting for a better future for everyone. So presumably this feels like a really good topic for you. As a co-director, you're working with and hearing directly from young people as well. What's your perspective on this topic?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we work with young people who are marginalised, particularly in Bristol, ages between 18 and 30, which is a group that a lot of people are like, oh, is that really young? But actually in the context of the world and in terms of the pandemic and various other factors, they're often the ones that are forgotten about and left behind, and also are dealing with a lot of anxiety about the future. Just to even speak from my own perspective, I'm in my 20s, I'm a co-director of an organisation which is like a massive privilege. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to have a house. I don't know whether I'm going to have children. I don't know, I'm not compelled by the idea of a pension or even life insurance. So in terms of the ways in which I'm moving into the world, and a lot of our community are moving into the world, there's not the traditional anchors to society are not the same. And even though you're kind of feeling this sense of deep anxiety and a lot of grief, that actually opens up a possibility for opportunity to really, like Sophie was saying, being able to see the gaps or to be able to open up possibilities of what might happen and be more aligned with this idea of stewardship. So at Rising, that feels really important to us, and being able to think differently about the ways in which we're engaging with institutions. There is a lot of distrust, as Sophie was saying, of institutions, of bureaucracy, of political systems, but using that to our advantage and being like, okay, so you have absolutely no stakes in this, so you can do whatever you want. Like, what could it be? And using art as that vehicle for reimagining, and then using our, I guess, the kind of capital that we're building in our space and our networks to be able to, fuck shit up, if I'm allowed to say that. Like, what is a synonym for that?
You're totally allowed to say that. And you just mentioned that word reimagining. And we'll come on to Amira in a second, but one of the things that Paul Hamlyn Foundation we've been doing is talking to young people about what that future far out future could look like. And one of the pieces of feedback we're getting is actually doing that reimagining work is hard, because people don't feel they've got the capabilities or the time and emotional space to be able to get into that. So if you were to wave a magic wand, and I don't need you to speak on behalf of all young people, that's really grossly unfair of me, but if you were talking to those with wealth and a particular power, in terms of your futures, in terms of the young people that you work with, as well as future generations, what are the things that you want people to be considering? That, you know, there are people with wealth and power sitting in this audience today.
So I guess from the first, I think understanding that the young people are the stewards, or will be the stewards, so how can you use your wealth to nurture stewardship? Thinking about pleasure and joy-based, joy-based work is actually, as you said, reimagining, finding joy. You know, it's really, really difficult, and it's actually a practice to be able to, to be part of pleasure activism. So thinking about how you can use your wealth and the money or capital, whatever you have, resources that you have, to be able to invest in that. And thinking about actually how we support younger people, young generations to be wealth holders in the myriad ways that is, not just about money, but also in terms of wealth of life. But also recognizing that if we are going to be the stewards, and if we are kind of moving into this point of stewardship, we have got a lot of generational trauma and that needs to be dealt with. So like, if you're thinking of like, okay, what can I do now that's going to help the future? It's like looking at who we have here and being like, you guys are messed up, understandably, like things don't feel right. Let's hold space for things to not feel or make sense. Let's not normalize what we're living in right now. And also changing your relationship to risk, I would say. Dreaming, getting involved with art and creativity, because it really can be like that vessel to kind of breaking through what you see right now, to be able to kind of reimagine other ways of being. Yeah.
So Amira, we first met on a windy mountain Windy Hill in Bristol, and we were doing some of this trying to imagine ourselves into a different space. And you use the power of creativity and poetry to inspire, and you're an activist in your own right as well. What's your response to some of the things we're beginning to talk about here?
Well, first of all, I think you've brought up really, really important points. But the one thing that really has always stood out to me and still stands out to me now is mental health and how much that's had an impact, not only on, like you mentioned, there's a lot of generational trauma, so on us in our 20s, but also the younger people. And like I work a lot with young people. I'm a supervisor for a youth-led cafe in my local area. I work with a lot of young people in youth centres. I've facilitated a project last week which was about creativity and activism. And what I'm noticing with a lot of the young people is that there's not a lot of space for creative outlets and like creative expression. And I feel like there's a lot of new boxes for them to fit in. So as much as we've expanded in what we accept and how we accept people in communities and things like that, at the same time, there's brand new boxes that people feel like they need to fit in, and like the ways that they need to look and the way that they need to speak and the way they need to present themselves. That's a whole new type of anxiety. And I think we won't understand that because it's a new generation thing with social media and the way that they feel like they want to be perceived online and the way they want to be perceived to their friends and then to their family. It's like lots of different identities. And it's also really difficult to find a space. Specifically, I'm talking from my experiences, working class woman from a South Asian background. A space to speak about your mental health is so difficult. Like, I was lucky enough to have, my mum and my sister where we can have those conversations very openly. But if I wanted to look for like professional help, there's a huge stigma around that. That wasn't something I thought about initially, because if I did, I immediately had the thoughts of, does that mean that you have a problem? And what's wrong if there's a problem? And what are people going to say? There's so many things that come with it before even vocalizing that to yourself, let alone to other people. And then even when you do want to take that step, the access to those are so difficult. Like, I couldn't afford going to therapy even if I wanted to when I was seeking it. And I can't imagine what it's like for young people who maybe feel like they don't have someone to speak to. You know, a lot of people don't have parents they can speak to, or siblings or friends. Loneliness is on the rise, like it is increasing as the days go by, and it's really sad to see how isolated people can really feel. Like, even in one of the projects that I was facilitating last week, one of the girls was like, she was doing so much, like she was really expressing herself with like poetry and speaking in front of the group and like really becoming confident. And then she took a few minutes outside and she asked if she could speak to me, and she was like, you know, I really feel like I'm doing well, and like I really want to speak in front of people, but at the same time my friends in there are making me feel weird for standing up in front of everyone and like really participating and enjoying this. And she was like, I just want to do what I'm doing, but I feel pressures to be a certain way around my friends. And that kind of individuality that you get through creativity, like I feel like there's a massive gap between that. So any way that we can, I feel like if we can mend the gap between mental health and young people through creativity, because everyone is a creative in their own way. I don't think it's, you know, certain people are creatives. Everyone is good at something in a very particular way, and I think there should always be space for people to express that, because that's when you see their face light up. It's one of my favorite things, to see people talk about something they love and they get really excited about it. And I think, yeah, young people don't have the spaces for that, and I think especially in relation to mental health, it's really, really declining. There's no access to it. There's no space for conversation around it, and people don't know where to go. Like, I think that's a really big part.
Sophie, you know, we're hearing this really deep sense of anxiety and worry and empathy for the experiences of young people today. And your work was absolutely about trying to hold us to account for young people of the future. And how do we toggle between those two spaces and recognise the tension that sits in both of those spaces? Because from my perspective, there must be a danger. I'm posing the question, but there must be a danger, mustn't there, that we focus on the out in the future, and actually the young people who are already distrusting of everything we as an older generation have mucked up or fucked up, just sit and look at us and go, this is complete indulgence, you thinking about over there, when actually we're really struggling right now and right here. How did you toggle between those two spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the interests of current generations and future generations are mutually exclusive. I think that the starting point, and this is what we've, you know, always said in Wales, and the approach that we've taken in Wales, is choose to do the things as a priority which contribute to the well-being of both. And there are also a number of kind of principles in the Future Generations Act by ways by which our institutions should work. So they must look to the long term, show they've considered long term, prevent problems from occurring or getting worse, integrate their actions. So this is recognising the kind of connections between everything, collaborate to work together and involve citizens. So I think if you apply those 5 principles, of course, younger people are, you know, younger people in the here and now, and then we're also talking in terms of future generations about the unborn, but younger people are closest, if you like, to the unborn. And in terms of what we've just been discussing on mental health, if we were actually properly listening and engaging with young people, mental health is not a new thing. Young people, you know, back when I started as commissioner, young people were saying to me, there was, you know, 3 things that came up every single time, and it was mental health, climate, and often kind of skills and jobs and the education system and those sorts of things. And yet our systems are not geared up to listen to young people and to act on what they're telling us. We almost need to wait for a crisis. And if you look at the sort of, you know, the stats and so on in terms of the massive increase in young people in particular, seeking help around mental health and the acute, access to acute services and so on. We've completely failed to do any of that. So I think there's something around, and that's not going to go away. If we were listening to young people now, that would be equipping also future generations, those yet to be born, or equipping a system to do better for those generations. If you turn that on its head and you look at things like, if we invested our money, for example, our infrastructure money, instead of building roads, on improving the quality of people's homes, that's good for current generations. It keeps older people out of hospital in the winter months. It provides job opportunities in terms of the people who are going to be investing in or doing the work on people's homes. It reduces our carbon emissions, which is good for both current and future generations. So you can see there where the policy choices are focused on how do we apply this well-being lens in terms of benefits for current and future generations, you would choose to do different things. The point that I'm making, I guess, is that our governance generally doesn't in any way force us to do that, or it's not a kind of consideration. So that is what needs to change. And I think there's also something, when I talk about governance, it can be the kind of, it's the unsexy stuff, isn't it? Who wants to talk about governance? But if we look at some of the massive challenges that both current young generations and actually every generation who's alive over the next sort of decade or so will be experiencing on climate change, and the even bigger challenges that future generations will be experiencing on climate change. What we see is a system where world leaders, they go off to COP once a year, they make commitments, and then they come back the following year having not delivered on any of them, really. We see the same with the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's because when they come back to base, when they come back to their systems and the way in which they operate, there is no requirement for them to act in the long term, no requirement for them to join the dots between different things, and no one holding them to account on how they do that. So that is when the governance becomes, far from being unsexy, it becomes absolutely critical to actually addressing any of these challenges, these big challenges that we've got coming at us.
To describe myself as a governance nerd, I think it's so critical in so many of these issues. Euella, you were nodding along here really enthusiastically. What are you campaigning about? What are you thinking about at Rising Arts at the moment?
Yeah, so governance is our thing.
Is it?
Yeah, and it's weird because I don't think many people would see the link between art and creativity and governance, and challenging governance and thinking about new ways and forms of leading and work cultures. But for us, that felt like the massive block in terms of like young people being able to self-actualize. It was governance, it was not having access to leadership, it was leadership being undiverse, but also in terms of like the way you have to be when you're leading. It's almost like you have to put on a certain armor and act a certain way that feels completely alien and disconnected to the way in which we exist and the ways in which we need to be human in order to get through the crises that we're facing. So ever since Rising has been around for the last 7 years, we focused on leadership in the ways of bringing young people onto boards, not just recruiting them on, not just like training them, but actually thinking about how can we mess with the system and the way it's done, and working with the boards to do things differently. Rising hands down its leadership every 5 years to younger directors, hence why I'm here, but I'm getting older. So in the next 2 years or so, me and my co-director are going to hand it over to other young people, and it really changes your relationship to stewardship, because it's not a power or ego thing. It's actually about we think this is a really great model around people not staying in the same role or holding positions of power for ages until they, retire or they die. A lot of people, you have to just wait till they die, and then maybe you might get a spot. It's like, right, you're up. So thinking about how we can do that differently, and we want to try and model it in Rising, but also we use our creative agency, which not many people understand, to basically get in there a bit like a Trojan horse, but then mess stuff up.
Can you give us an example of getting right in there and messing stuff up, or or being disruptive in the best possible sense of that word.
Yeah, so like, for example, maybe an organisation might be like, oh, let's do like a mural in our office sort of thing. Or let's like, we would love to get a young artist to do some work. And then we have a meeting with them, be like, oh, what are you guys really interested in? And we talk to them, and then we realise actually the problem is actually the workplace dynamics. You guys thought a mural in your office would be the thing, but actually you don't have a culture of care in your organisation. So we do like a workshop led by young people about how do you like think about conflict and harm and caring work cultures, and we do like a 4-week training with them, and then we'd be like, oh, like maybe it's your governance. Maybe like who's leading your teams, and then bring young people onto their board, or think about how they can do the reverse mentoring thing that Sophie was mentioning. So there's lots of different ways, and Rising is a little bit of a choose your own adventure, but ultimately we understand that like by investing in the ways in which young people can feel safe and secure in their world, and that's not just at work but at home, and thinking about work-life balance and all these crazy ass things that we're dealing with, it benefits everybody. It really does benefit everybody. So we work, with creativity. If you want a kind of a basic kind of like servicing situation, we can do that, but we're really interested in the deep, deep work that isn't often sexy, that funders are like, how does this meet the charitable aims? Like, it's like, it's kind of hard to articulate what we do, but for us, it's really important that we're able to make our own money, because that gives us a sense of, wealth holding, in a sense. Yeah.
I think there's a whole other conversation
definitely.
about the charitable, the way charitable status works at the moment, and what it allows and what it doesn't allow, and how that actually stifles some of the things that you're talking about. Yeah. Amira, you talked really passionately about kind of some of the challenges that your generation, that some of the young people that you're working with are facing now. How much are you able to work with them on that sort of sense of a better future? How much do you feel they want to engage in that conversation?
I think they really want to engage. I think from my experience in working with young people, they're super passionate, and they just have very different ways of expressing what they think and feel. And I think we need to, again, allow space for it to come in all those different ways, whether that's writing, performing, music, like there's so many different ways to express those things. And I think creativity has been so, I mean, especially for my generation, like when I was going through school, creativity wasn't looked at as something important. It was looked at as like just a hobby, but you do your main things in school, like math, science, English, whatever. But creativity was always put aside, but actually I think it's a really, really important way to get your brain working around those very serious things. And I think if that's something that can become an integral part for young people through the school system, through what they do outside of school, that would be super important. And actually as part of my master's, for my dissertation, I'm looking at, because I'm doing journalism and media, so I'm looking at like media engagement and media literacy between like mainstream media and marginalized communities, and specifically between like with young people in particular. And we were talking about the growing distrust. There's a massive distrust not only in institutions but in the media as well, and that is purely because through multiple interviews that I've found that they feel like they're not being listened to, and when they are being listened to, it's kind of like they're being interrogated. I had one woman, part of a project that I worked on, looking at media engagement and things like that, who basically said that she felt like mainstream news and journalism felt like policing, like it felt like the way they were speaking to her, the way journalists speak to her, feels like police officers interrogating her. And that's not just her. There's lots of people from different marginalized communities who feel that way. But I think specifically for young people, they feel like they've lost their voice. And I think creativity is a really important way to get that through. So yeah, all I can say is I work in lots of different areas with young people. I don't do like one specific thing, but I always try to help them with their self-confidence. I struggled a lot with imposter syndrome, and I've even had that even coming on today. It's like sometimes you kind of question yourself about where you are and if you're worthy of being in that place, and you know, how did I get here and things like that. But I think because I've experienced that and I'm still experiencing those kind of thoughts and emotions, it's a really good relatable point to have with the young people. And I think conversation with them is so important, like really sitting with them and understanding where they're coming from, what their experiences might be and why they might respond to certain things. I think the empathy and understanding really all comes into that. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. I think you'd be surprised how many people in this room would actually recognise some of those feelings as well. I think there's something very powerful about what you're talking about here, and there's almost a sense of if we were to think about that creativity in school and changing the way we support young people in having that voice, that might be too terrifying for some of those who are holding wealth and power to actually contemplate. Sophie, I'm coming back to you. Can we talk specifically about wealth holders at this time and what it would look like if they did make a commitment to future generations? What would be happening differently, both within the context you've worked in previously, but you're now beginning to advise people across the globe about some of this stuff. So again, we have got people who are responsible for wealth in this audience and online as well. What would a commitment look like for funders, for institutional wealth holders? What would we all be doing differently?
Well, I suppose the positive news is that there are countries across the world now who are embracing approaches similar to what we've taken in Wales. Not all of them are legislating, some of them are building up to legislation. So anything from a parliamentary caucus has been set up in the Kenyan Senate, to Norway, who is amending their Public Health Act to embed long-term wellbeing goals and concepts around intergenerational fairness, to a whole range of different. There's too many countries to mention in a way. I suppose the biggest development is that the UN this year are intending. There's going to be a summit of the future in September of this year in New York. And that will pass a declaration for future generations, which is currently being negotiated by member states. So as the current wording stands, it commits member states to putting in place arrangements to safeguard the interests of future generations in their countries. So that's really, really encouraging. The challenge, I think, in terms of how do we actually make that happen and how do we make sure that we're not just making that a kind of performative thing. So it's really easy to set up foresight institutions. It's, reasonably easy, although, you have to take a brave government who's going to appoint an independent commissioner to hold them to account. But there are three critical elements, from research and work that I've been doing with the School of International Futures that we think are essential in terms of embedding systems of intergenerational fairness. So you have to involve citizens in shaping long-term goals. You have to have political champions in the system. So those political champions, all politicians have to be committed to taking intergenerationally fair decisions. And then you have to have capacity and capability within the system, so within your civil servants and so on, in terms of how do they apply long-term techniques and futures techniques and so on. And what does that mean in terms of the way they take decisions? And that requires a lot of support and investment, because we're trying to change the habits within the system, both the system itself, how it's structured and how it operates, but also the people within it. We're trying to change the habits not just of one lifetime but of many lifetimes, and a lot of barriers in those systems to the real pull of the short term. So if there was something that the wealth holders could do now, I think it would be to recognise that there's a particular moment this year in September with this global declaration, and really see that as the starting point around how then do we use that moment to help to support countries to reform their systems of governance, to embed intergenerational fairness and equity. And we need really a critical mass of countries to be that kind of tipping point. We've already got some of those who were starting this even before the declaration. So if we can accelerate the progress that they are making, get them really doing this work properly, I think that that will, you know, start to have a kind of snowball effect with all the rest of the countries in the world. Well, maybe not all of them, but a significant number of countries throughout the world following suit. And
it sounds like, if you're thinking about philanthropy, some of the things that people have started to do just need to amplify enormously. So that longer term funding, core funding for organisations, but also maybe bidding in that commitment again as philanthropic organisations to think about those future generations as part of the considerations.
I think absolutely right. I can tell you as well from experience of, you know, rolling sleeves up and actually getting into the system of government in Wales and in other countries, what is not needed is more toolkits, frameworks, research, all of those sorts of things. Okay, there is a plethora of them. We know what all the problems are. We actually know what a lot of the solutions are. It's the actual practical work alongside officials in this department in the Australian Commonwealth government. This is a real life example, to actually say, okay, so how, when we're grappling with, you know, we need to meet these budget priorities and, you know, we've got a 3-year electoral cycle and there's this and there's this, how do we start shifting that system? It's that practical support from people who've done it before, from experts, from bringing in young people to challenge the thinking, bringing in new creative ways of doing that. It's that sort of stuff that is needed, rather than a report that you can churn out in a year and tick a box that you've done it. So this is about long-term investment in supporting transformational change, rather than just, you know, reporting on it, if you like.
It feels like we need a one of you in almost every institution I can think of, as well as that sort of independent broker and holder to account as well. Because I think it's very, you know, I don't want to do a poor me thing, but I think it's very easy once you're inside institutions, inside government, to kind of get stuck in the systems of doing and not to invite that challenge into the processes that you're undertaking.
I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, some of the conversations that I would have with government, don't get me wrong, they didn't always like me coming in and, you know, challenging them and, you know, having public spats with them and doing all of those sorts of things. But there were also conversations where, you know, I'm not going to name names, where people were saying, you know, I'm actually, even this was politicians, senior civil servants, we're trying to change the system and actually be really helpful if you could be, you know, needling from the outside, if you like, to say you have legal duties to do this, and I'm going to hold you to account if you don't do that. That element is important, but also, you know, as I said, that getting alongside, really rolling your sleeves up and working through, because it's not because, you know, politicians are not all bad, you know, public officials are not all bad. There's, you know, 1,700 of them here in Berlin who are what I would describe as the frustrated champions in their system who are trying to drive this change. They need that sort of support to enable them to do that, as well as that external challenge. So the final thing I'll say is that actually within the one of the big debates that's going on in the UN system at the moment is whether there will be the appointment of a UN special envoy for future generations, which I suppose is the kind of global equivalent of the role that I held in Wales. And some member states are not that keen on that, you know, because they want to mark their own homework, if you like. I actually think that's a critical element of accountability and supporting the change that's needed.
Thank you. I think I'm going to ask somebody to make me a T-shirt with creative bureaucrat written across it. I think it would suit me down to the ground. We're coming to the end of this session, and I have promised that I will finish on time. So my last question to all of you, and you can respond however you want to this, is to reflect a little bit on what it means to personally be a good ancestor, to be thinking about that better, more joyful, I think was the word you used, future. So for you, what does it mean to be a good ancestor? How does it sit with you?
I think for me it would be around the pleasure activism that I was mentioning before, like the joy. As I said, it's really, really hard to be, like, to do things that feel good, and not just around like living in ecstasy, which I'm really down for, but it's about actually moving through the world in ways that feel good. And like most of the spaces that we occupy don't feel good, whether it's in your workplace, whether it's in society, you know, whether it's in your body, like we don't feel good. And like if you can model that, and being a good pleasure activist ancestor of like that person lived well and created spaces where others could feel good in them. I think that is, yeah, I really think that might just be, if you don't feel like you have a lot of power, which I think you might actually have a lot more power than that, but I think if you feel like you don't have a lot of power, I think just modeling that as a practice would be transformative. Yeah.
You're getting loads of stuff in the audience. I can feel it. Yeah.
Let's just have pleasure today, guys.
It's really interesting, isn't it, Amira? Because one of the things we talked about on that windy hill was around exactly that, was around the space of care and of coming together and actually eating together and being provided for and with. All of those things were really important to that group that we talked to. Obviously, you're nodding along to that. What else brings to mind when you think about being a good ancestor?
I really love that question, first of all, because I really, like, I'm glad you answered first because it gave me a minute to think. But I think, like, all the things that you mentioned and what we did in this windy place that we were in for a few days, but I think for me, I really, really appreciate history and like historical figures, and as boring as that might sound, they're the people that obviously came before us and they inspire me to this day. People like Malcolm X, he's like one of my biggest inspirations, but also in the way that we do things in relation to our ancestors. I think the things that you said, like eating together and doing things together, I think that community importance, that's something that's really important in my culture, in my ancestry. Something that I really wanted to get back in touch with through my activism and through my creativity. So even through poetry, like I was born in the UK, but I feel really connected to my homeland in Bangladesh. So when I write, I try to research like old, poets from Bangladesh or musicians, or even talk to my dad about the people that he would talk to and spend time with. And I think to be able to connect with my ancestry and like my culture is really special to me, and I think that's something everyone can do with like everyone has their own ancestry, and I think it's really nice to be able to connect in that way and then use that as inspiration for your creativity, whatever that is, be that music, poetry, again, performance, anything. But I think, through creativity, activism, and through the community things. To me, I think it's really important to eat together. I think you learn a lot from eating with people and speaking to them and learning about their cultures and their foods and everything. I think, so those are just a few things,
Sophie, how does that question land with you?
I'm really pleased that we just picked up on kind of culture and heritage, because actually what we need to recognise is that, I'm a white Welsh woman talking about future generations. This is a concept that Indigenous people and communities have been practicing for, centuries, 4 generations. So the Iroquois who embed 7th generation thinking into their decisions. So everything that they do, they think about how does that play out to the 7th generation. I was with some people doing some work in Aotearoa, New Zealand this morning, where there's this concept of mokapuna, which is around this kind of future generations thinking. So there's something there in terms of, I think, us in the global north accepting that actually we've got a lot of this entirely wrong, and there are a huge number of lessons that we could and should be learning from Indigenous wisdom. So I think that's really important. To do that, I think we need to give up power to some of those better ideas and concepts to younger generations. Or, if you're a director of, health in a, or, the chief executive of a health board or a health institution, sometimes that's giving up power into another policy area because they might be better in the long term to deliver long-term health outcomes. So I think this is around this sort of partnership and so on. And then the final thing that I would say is, you know, there's a lot for younger generations and future generations to be pessimistic about, but there's also a lot to be optimistic about. And I think there's the challenge for us is to be, you know, not optimistic enough that we don't relax, but not pessimistic enough that we give up, because I think it's all to play for.
Thank you, Sophie. I'm sitting here thinking about generational inequity and guilt. And guilt is a kind of an environment which is makes you feel very static and unable to respond. And you mentioned the entirety of the population being engaged in that conversation about future goals. And I think personally there's something about being older and actually stepping into a more radical space on behalf of and with those future generations, rather than sitting there with our heads in the sand or just feeling too guilty to do anything about it. So there's something for me in that space, which is these guys and you have really energized me to go away today and think about that as I listen to the rest of the conversations. Thank you all for your contribution. Amira, Euella, Sophie, the audience will now thank you in the traditional way.